I never thought the day I almost lost everything would be the same day I found out what I was actually worth. And the person who showed me that, he did it without saying a single word. Because by then, he couldn't anymore. My Uncle Herschel had been sick for about 2 years before he passed, Parkinson's. Then a series of small strokes that took pieces of him slowly, the way water wears down stone. I was 31 when he died. I drove him to every appointment for the last 14 months of his life. I rearranged my shifts at the warehouse, burned through my PTO, borrowed money twice just to keep my own lights on while I was spending 3 days a week at his place in Denton. I didn't do it for anything. I did it because he was the only person in my family who ever showed up for me first, my wife at the time. I'll just call her my wife because I still have a hard time saying her name without something tightening in my chest. She didn't come with me. Not once. She said Herschel made her uncomfortable. Said the house smelled like illness. Said she had her own life, and I needed to stop martyring myself for a dying old man who wasn't even my father. She wasn't wrong that he wasn't my father. My father left when I was 8. Herschel stepped in. He taught me to change a tire, showed me how to write a check, sat in the front row of my high school graduation when no one else from my family did. He was the kind of man who remembered what mattered. I think that's why, in the end, what he left behind was shaped the way it was. He died on a Tuesday in October. Cold morning. I got the call at 5:47 a.m. and I sat in my truck in the driveway for about 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. My wife was still asleep. I didn't wake her. I already knew, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I was grieving alone on this one. The funeral was that Saturday. I handled the arrangements because Herschel had no children of his own, and his only sibling, my mother's older brother, had been estranged from him for almost 15 years over something involving a loan and a piece of land that never got resolved. That brother's name was Russ. He showed up at the funeral in a pressed gray suit with his wife Pamela and their daughter Courtney, who I'd met maybe 4 times in my life. They sat in the second row. Courtney cried loudly. Russ gave a short speech about family and legacy that made me stare at the floor. My wife sat next to me in the front row and checked her phone twice during the service. After the burial, back at the church hall, I overheard Russ tell Pamela that these things usually take a few weeks to sort out. I didn't know what he meant at the time. I found out later. Herschel's attorney, a quiet man named Beaumont who had an office above a dry cleaner in Denton, called me the following Wednesday and asked me to come in. I assumed it was to sign paperwork. I'd been named executor 2 years earlier, when Herschel had updated his documents after the first major stroke. I knew that much. What I didn't know was the rest. I told my wife I had an appointment. She asked if it was the will thing. I said yes. She said, let me know how much. Like it was a transaction. Like Herschel was an ATM we'd been waiting on. I didn't say anything back. I drove to Denton alone. Beaumont had me sit across from his desk, and he pulled out a folder and set it between us without opening it yet. He looked at me for a second and then said, before I go through this, I want you to know that your uncle was very deliberate. He updated this document 3 times in the last 2 years. He knew what he was doing. Herschel's estate was not small. He had owned a commercial property in Fort Worth that he'd been renting to a logistics company for 11 years. He had investments, a savings account, the house in Denton. Beaumont told me the total appraised value was somewhere around $1.4 million. I felt strange hearing that number. Not excited. Strange. Like I was hearing about someone else's life. Russ received a specific bequest, a pocket watch that had belonged to their father, and a handwritten letter. That was it. The letter, Beaumont told me, explained why. Courtney received nothing. I received everything else. I drove home in a daze. I didn't know how to feel. I kept thinking about the last time I'd sat with Herschel at the kitchen table in Denton, helping him eat soup because his hands weren't steady enough to hold the spoon without spilling. He'd looked at me at one point and said, you know the difference between you and most people? I'd asked what? He said, you don't keep score. I thought he was just talking. I didn't know he was also writing it down somewhere. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck again for a minute. Then I went inside. My wife was in the kitchen on her laptop. She looked up and said, so? I told her. She was quiet for a second. Then she stood up and said, okay, that's real money. She said it like something had shifted, like a gear clicking into place. She came around the counter and hugged me. which she hadn't done in probably 3 months without me initiating it first. That night, she wanted to talk about the property. She wanted to talk about what we could sell, what we could keep, whether we should move to Fort Worth. She had ideas about the house in Denton. She talked about renovating it and listing it. She said, we could finally get out of this neighborhood. I listened. I didn't say much. Something felt off and I couldn't name it exactly. Just that the warmth in her voice was new in a way that made me uneasy. Over the next 3 weeks, things shifted in ways I kept telling myself were normal. She started being affectionate again. She started asking about the estate, the timelines, what Beaumont had said. She mentioned her sister needed help with the down payment. She mentioned that her car had been making a noise. She started coming to bed at the same time as me instead of staying up on her phone. I kept telling myself this was good. People change. Hard times test a marriage, and maybe this was the other side of that. Then Russ called. He got my number from my mother, who I have a complicated relationship with. He was polite at first, said he wanted to reach out family to family. Said he thought Herschel's decision was made under undue influence and that he'd spoken to an attorney. Said he wasn't trying to make trouble. He just wanted what was fair. I told him I'd have Beaumont call him. My wife overheard my half of the conversation. When I got off the phone, she said, "What did he want?" I told her. She said, "He can't do anything, right? Like legally?" Her voice had a tension in it that I hadn't heard directed at Russ before. Only at me, usually, when I hadn't done something she wanted fast enough. I said I didn't know yet. She said, "You need to protect this." I think that was the moment something inside me got very quiet. Not angry, just quiet. Like the way air gets still before something changes. The estate process moved slower than either of us expected, which is normal. Beaumont had warned me it would take several months to settle properly, file the right documents, clear the property titles. Meanwhile, I was still working my shifts at the warehouse. We were still living the same way. Nothing had changed yet in a practical sense. But my wife started changing in small ways that added up. She started making comments about my job, about how I didn't need to keep doing it, about how I should be thinking bigger now. She brought up a business idea her brother had, some kind of dropshipping thing, and asked if I consider investing. When I said I wanted to wait until everything was actually settled, she got frustrated. Called me cautious. Then called me paranoid. One evening in November, I came home from a late shift and found her on the phone in the bedroom with the door mostly closed. I heard her say, "I don't know, he's dragging his feet on everything." She went quiet when she heard me come in. I started sleeping worse. In December, Beaumont called to tell me that Russ had formally contested the will. His attorney had filed a claim arguing that Herschel had been in cognitive decline at the time he last updated the documents, and that I had isolated him from family in his final months. I sat in Beaumont's office and felt something hot move through my chest. Isolated him. I had driven him to chemotherapy appointments. I had slept on his couch during the bad weeks. I had sat with him through the fear and the confusion and the long silences that illness brings. And somewhere Russ had found an attorney who would argue that I had isolated the man. Beaumont was calm. He said this kind of claim was not unusual and that we had strong documentation. The medical records, my name on every intake form, the home health agency logs, 2 years of receipts and calendars and notes. He said, "This will not succeed, but it will take time." I went home and told my wife. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long?" I said, "Maybe 6 more months, maybe longer." She said, "I can't keep waiting like this." I looked at her and said, "Waiting like what? Nothing has changed for us." She said, "That's the problem." We didn't talk for the rest of the night. Over the next few weeks, she got distant again. The warmth evaporated. She stopped asking about the estate. She started going out more in the evenings, coming home late, being vague about where. I didn't push because I was exhausted and because some part of me already knew and didn't want to have the conversation yet. It came in January, a cold Saturday afternoon. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table I'd eaten breakfast at every morning for 4 years, and told me she wanted a separation. She said she'd been unhappy for a long time. She said we wanted different things. She said she'd been talking to someone, a therapist, who helped her see that she needed more. I asked if there was someone else. She didn't answer right away. Then she said that wasn't the point. I said okay. She said she'd already looked at apartments. She said she'd move out within the month. She said she hoped we could be adults about it. I said okay again. She left on a Friday in February. She took her things, the good coffee maker, the TV from the bedroom, the Dutch oven I'd bought her for her birthday. She hugged me at the door, which I hadn't expected, and said, "I hope the estate stuff works out for you." Like she was a neighbor. Like 4 years were a transaction that had simply come to a close. I stood in the doorway and watched her car back out of the driveway. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and didn't move for a long time. The next few months were the kind of quiet that either breaks you or teaches you something. I went to work. I talked to Beaumont. I gathered documentation for the contest case. I ate bad food and watched too much late-night TV and called my friend Maddox, who'd known me since we were teenagers, and he drove down from Oklahoma City one weekend, and we sat on the back porch and didn't talk about much, and that somehow helped more than anything else. In April, Russ's attorney requested a deposition. I sat in a conference room for 2 hours and answered questions about my relationship with Herschel, about my presence at his home, about every decision made in his last 2 years. It was one of the more uncomfortable experiences of my life, but Beaumont had prepared me well. I had documentation for everything, every appointment, every call log, every medical form I'd signed as emergency contact. Russ was not present at the deposition. Courtney was, briefly, in the waiting area. She looked at me when I walked out, and I thought she might say something. She didn't. In June, Russ withdrew the contest. Beaumont called me on a Tuesday morning. He said it simply, no fanfare, he withdrew. Unconditionally. I asked if there was anything else. He said no. That we'd move forward with the final distribution and it would likely close by August. I sat in my truck in the warehouse parking lot for a few minutes after that call. I wasn't elated. I was just tired in a way that was also, somewhere under it, relief. My wife, my ex-wife by then, the divorce had finalized in May, texted me that same day. I don't know how she found out. Maybe she still had a connection to someone who knew Russ. I never asked. The text said, "Hey, heard things moved forward. Really glad for you. Let me know if you ever want to grab coffee and catch up." I read it twice. I set the phone on the passenger seat and looked out the windshield at the warehouse loading dock for a while. Then I typed back, "Take care of yourself." And I put the phone in my pocket and went back to work. The estate closed in late August, almost 10 months after Herschel died. I kept the property in Fort Worth because the tenant had 3 years left on their lease, and it made more sense than selling. I sold the house in Denton to a young couple who walked through it twice and made an offer the second week. I stood in the kitchen one last time before closing, by the table where I'd helped him with his soup, and I just stood there for a minute. You don't need to say anything out loud for something to count. I paid off my truck. I put a significant amount into savings and into a managed account. Beaumont helped me set up. I donated a chunk to a Parkinson's research organization in Herschel's name. I gave Maddox a loan he didn't ask for and will probably never pay back, and I don't care. I kept working at the warehouse for another 4 months until I had a clear enough picture of what came next. I wasn't in a rush anymore. A few weeks after the estate closed, I ran into Courtney at a gas station in Denton. We were both filling up. She looked up and we had one of those moments where you recognize each other, but neither of you moves right away. Then she walked over. She looked tired. She said her dad wasn't doing well, that the whole contest process had cost more than they expected, and that things between her parents had gotten strained. I didn't say anything about the money. I just said I was sorry to hear it. She said, "He knew, didn't he? Herschel. He knew exactly what he was doing." I said, "Yeah, I thought he did." She said, "My dad's going to have a hard time with that for the rest of his life." I nodded. She looked at me for a second and then said, "You took care of him." Not an accusation, just a fact, said plainly. I said somebody had to. She went back to her car. I finished filling my tank. I thought about what she'd said on the drive home. He knew exactly what he was doing. That's the thing about people like Herschel. They're not loud about it. They watch carefully for a long time and then they act once, decisively, and the act does all the talking for them. I don't think about my ex-wife much anymore. When I do, it's not with anger. It's more like the way you think about a storm that happened. You know it was bad, you remember what it did, but you're not standing in it anymore. What I think about more is that Tuesday morning in October, sitting in my truck in my driveway at 5:47 a.m., with my phone in my hand, knowing I was about to start driving toward something I couldn't prepare for. And I think about the 2 years before that, the appointments, the bad weeks, the kitchen table, the soup, and I think I would do all of it again, not because of what it turned into, because of what it was. That's what Herschel was trying to say, I think. Not with the money. The money was just the form it took. What he was saying was, I saw you. I watched how you lived when no one was keeping score. And I want you to know I was keeping score. Some people will spend their whole lives waiting for someone to see that in them. If you're lucky, someone does. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any mystical way. Just the plain, observable kind. The kind where you watch how a person treats someone who can't give them anything, and you learn everything you need to know about who they actually are. My wife didn't leave because things got hard. She left because the thing she'd been waiting for, the payout, the upgrade, the version of our life that finally matched what she thought she deserved, didn't arrive on her schedule. She'd been patient in her own way, and when patience ran out, so did she. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it like a fact, the way you describe weather. What I keep coming back to is Herschel. He watched people for a long time before he acted. He didn't make speeches about loyalty or character. He just paid attention. He saw how I showed up. Not for reward, not because anyone was grading me, but because he needed someone, and I was there. And he filed that away somewhere quiet inside himself. And then, when the moment came, he made one clear decision. That's integrity in its simplest form. Not a value you announce, a pattern you live quietly over years. I think about that when I consider the kind of person I want to be going forward. Not impressive, not loud, just consistent in the ways that actually count, especially when no one's watching. Russ spent energy contesting something he couldn't win because he'd confused proximity with contribution. He shared a last name with Herschel. He showed up to the funeral in a pressed suit. He thought that was enough. It wasn't. And somewhere in the long months of the legal process, I think he started to understand why. That kind of reckoning, realizing you were present but absent in the ways that mattered, is one of the harder things a person can face. I don't envy him that. And Maddox, who drove down from Oklahoma City and sat on my back porch and just existed next to me when I had nothing to offer, he reminded me what real loyalty feels like. It doesn't ask what's in it for them. It just shows up. I try to remember that when I think about what kind of friend, what kind of person I want to be. What I came out of this understanding is that your life gets shaped mostly by what you do in the in-between moments. Not the big decisions, not the dramatic ones, but the Tuesday afternoons when someone needs a ride and you rearrange your schedule. The quiet weeks where you show up even when it costs you. The times you stay when leaving would be easier. Nobody's keeping score. Or so you think. But the people who love you well, the Herschels of your life, they see it. They always see it. And what you build by living that way isn't just a reputation or an inheritance. It's a self. A person you can actually live inside of without flinching. That's what he left me more than anything else.